Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to the program. This is the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these very critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, the guy I want to talk about today is a name maybe not familiar to most of us, but soon will be, I think. His name is Pete Hoekstra, and he is the newly appointed American ambassador to Canada. When a new administration comes in south of the border, of course, they bring their own people in. Joe Biden was a Democrat. He had his own ambassador here. Well, that guy got recalled. He's gone now. A Republican. Well, it's not even a Republican. Trump's not a Republican. He's a MAGA guy. But anyway, Pete Hoekstra is his choice to be the ambassador. So he'll be plopped up here in Ottawa. He had his first official interview as the American ambassador to the Canadian government with Politico a couple of days ago. And some of the things this guy said really get under my skin. And I want to talk to you about this and give you some sense of just where this guy's coming from. And I get this, by the way, right off the bat, that, yeah, when you're the ambassador appointed by the president, or in our case, the prime minister to a different land, it's your job to represent our government to that government. I understand that. But clearly, Pete Hoekstra is going to be another little marionette on the strings to the ravings of the orange guy in the White House. And that's somewhat problematic. You'd like to think that a guy like Hoekstra, especially given his background, he's from Michigan. He was a member of the Congress from the state of Michigan, which is a border state, which has had trade relationships with Canada for many, many years. You thought, oh, well, maybe this guy can give a different perspective. Maybe this guy can enlighten the Trump administration and the White House that there is a strong relationship between Canada and the U.S. and an inter relationship between trade between these two countries, especially between the province of Ontario and the state of Michigan. Well, no, not happening. Hoekstra apparently is just going to be a mouthpiece for the same Trump policies that's going on. And during this interview, a couple of things he said just jumped out at me. And I thought, where have you been? First of all, he said with mocked outrage, or maybe sincere outrage, it's hard to tell, that he was shocked. He said it's an insult. That the Canadian government has actually imposed sanctions on some American products, that they've decided to ban certain products from different American industries onto Canadian shelves. And we've talked about this, the Jack Daniels and the sour mash whiskeys and so many other different things. As a matter of fact, the province of Ontario especially has banned liquor, wine, beer, all that sort of thing, American stuff. And you've seen that on the shelves of the Liquor Control Board here. There are no American products anymore. A lot of establishments, restaurants and others, are not selling nor serving American products. And Hoekstra, Ambassador Hoekstra, says that that's an insult, and says that his quote here I found interesting. He says, "We have never done anything like that to Canada. You've stabbed us in the back, Ambassador, at least your boss has anyway." I mean, what happens here, and what the Canadian government and the provincial governments in Ontario and BC and so many other different provinces have done right now, is respond to what Trump has done. Do you get it? This was not a unilateral decision. This is a response to the Trump administration basically instilling not just prohibitive, but crippling tariffs on Canadian industry that have had significant impacts, devastating impacts on the steel industry, on the aluminum industry, on the lumber industry, so many others. Canola, of course, out west is another element, and also a blatant attempt to try to not just circumvent, but almost bury the Canadian auto industry. What do you think, Ambassador Hoekstra? What do you think we're going to do? Sit back and say, oh, that's a damn shame, but that's your policy. I guess we're just going to have to live with it. No, we're not going to do that. Of course we're going to respond. And this is the way the governments respond. And make no mistake about it, the response that the Canadian government and the Ontario government and so many others have done right now is a response to the American government's actions. Period. End of sentence, okay? If Trump hadn't decided to renege on his very own commitments to the previous NAFTA free trade deal and to CUMSA, or whatever they want to call it down there, none of this would have happened. He signed a deal. He decided, I'm not going to live up to the terms of this. I'm going to break my own word. I made a commitment and a promise. I don't want to do it anymore. Well, how do you deal with a guy like that? Of course you have to respond in kind, which is what the Canadian government and Ontario governments and others are doing right now. So get over it, Ambassador Hoekstra, and don't pretend you're that, I hope not that naive anyway. You know darn well what's going on right now. The American government is all over Canadian economies, and we're supposed to just sit back and say, oh, well, we'll just handle that and take it. No, we may be happy and nice-going and easygoing people in this country, but we're not stupid. We know when somebody's dumping on us that we're going to do something about it and we're going to respond. Yet the impression that he gave during this interview with Politico was that the Americans are being wrong done by the Canadian reaction to this, that we're dumping all over them. We're not allowing those products to be sold here. Well, here's a little tip. I can't speak for the government, Ambassador. Drop the tariffs and everything will be fine. You'll have the American beer and everything else back on the shelves in no time at all. But drop the damn tariffs first. He keeps saying, well, the ball's in your court. The ball's in Canada's court to how to respond. No, the ball's in your court, Ambassador. The ball's in Donald Trump's court. Drop the tariffs, and the retaliatory indications of what we're doing here will be gone too. It's that simple. This is not rocket science. He goes on and on and on about this, basically trying to defend the Trump policies right now. And basically, I guess the attitude that I've heard from a lot of the people in Washington and a lot of the observers is that they can say and do whatever they want, and Canada just has to roll over and take it. Well, we're not doing that. That's certainly not what Prime Minister Carney has talked about, nor should it be. Canadians have to stand up for what's going on. Ambassador Hoekstra also says that he's very upset, speaking on behalf of the Trump White House, that Canadian governments and Canadian businesses are starting to look towards other areas like Europe and others, the European Union and Scandinavia and the Far East, to develop stronger ties. Just a couple of days ago, Prime Minister Carney had strong meetings with the Mexican president about developing stronger ties because of what's going on with the Trump policies. And he says, well, that's simply a decision the Canadian government has made, and we can't do much about that, but we're disappointed. We're doing it because you're on us, okay? How much more clear can we be on this? If the Americans had lived up to their expectations and lived up to their commitments from previous trade deals, this doesn't have to happen. But because our supposed best friend south of the border, our number one trading partner south of the border, has decided to stick a knife in our back, you're damn right we're going to start looking for other options. We're not turning our back on America. The message we're sending here is we can't count on you anymore. We thought we could take you at your word. We can't. So we can't simply sit back here and wait for you to stab us again. We still want to maintain a relationship, and maybe someday that relationship is going to be stronger than it is now. But in the meantime, we owe it to the Canadian people, we owe it to Canadian business and industry to start looking for other alternatives. And that's what this government's doing, and thank heavens that's what they're doing. And if you're upset about that, I'll go back to my initial answer. Drop the tariffs. Stop playing stupid games and start living up to the expectations and the commitments that your government, including the Trump government, has made. Don't forget, this existing deal that Trump simply wants to turn his back on and says, I don't want to play anymore, was signed by Donald Trump and negotiated by Donald Trump. And when he signed that deal years ago, he said, this is the greatest trade deal ever. It's going to be great for everybody, and Americans love this. Now, all of a sudden, he's changed his mind, and Canada is responding. And Ambassador Hoekstra either doesn't get it or is simply parroting everything that Trump is telling him to say right now. But we are going to respond. And I think that's the message that we've received from our Prime Minister. And I think it's the message that Canadians have embraced so much these days, that we're tired of it. There's a classic scene from the classic movie Network. It was done years and years ago. From the guy who worked at a network news station yelling out the window. He says, we're mad as hell. We're not going to take it anymore. Well, you know what? That's the Canadian attitude that we're taking. We are mad as hell. And we're not going to take the that we're getting from the Trump administration anymore. We're not simply going to roll over and say, well, if that's what they want to do, I guess we're just going to have to accept it. No, we're not. We have other options. Our preferred option is to maintain a friendly relationship, an environmentally sensitive relationship, and an economic partnership with the Americans. That's the way it's always been, and it's been mutually beneficial. But now you've got Trump and his minions, including apparently the new ambassador, Hoekstra, that simply want to say, well, to heck with that. We can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and you guys are just going to have to suck it up. Well, no, that's not. There are other options. It's not the preferred option, but it's one that we need to take. And it's a path that we need to take because of what Donald Trump has done and continues to do for the next little while. I'm proud of the way our government's responded to this. And I'm proud that we're looking at alternatives right now, because what this does is, I think, first of all, it underscores an ongoing concern that we have had for the longest time in this country, that we always feel as if the Americans simply take us for granted. And we can, just accept it. And if you don't like it, too damn bad. And he brought up Hoekstra's heritage, by the way, is Dutch. And it's interesting. and maybe somewhat serendipitous, he took over Ottawa, his office in Ottawa as the ambassador, just around the time that the Canadians were celebrating, and the Dutch government and the Dutch people were celebrating the liberation of Holland in World War II. And Canadian troops, American troops were involved in that too, so were British, but Canadian troops played a huge role in that whole enterprise. And ask anybody from Holland about that, and they'll tell you to this day, how many years after World War II, there's still a love relationship, an extremely strong tie between the Dutch people and the Canadians because of that liberation and because of the work the Canadians did. And as a person with Dutch heritage, Hoekstra should understand that. And he says, maybe the Canadians just simply got their noses out of joint because of movies like A Bridge Too Far, which really seem to simply focus on the American contribution to the liberation of Holland. And you know what? Yeah, it does. Because we know that's not the case. And that's another situation where Canadians have been victimized by the Americanization of history. And it happens time and time again. And for so long, we just kind of rolled over and said, well, so what? It wasn't the Americans. It was the Canadians that played a key role in the liberation of Holland. And it kind of reminded me, as I was listening to Hoekstra's comments, about another movie situation that happened a number of years ago. Remember the movie that was called Argo? Ben Affleck was in the movie. He portrayed it. And it was basically a retelling from the American perspective about the liberation of American hostages in Iran back in the late 1970s from the Ayatollah and the revolution that was going on. Remember that the Americans that had worked at the American embassy were being trapped, and some of them, of course, were held hostage for quite some time and didn't get released until after Jimmy Carter left office. But there were a number of them that got out. They were hidden. They were secreted out way and got out before all the hit the fan there. And the movie Argo, which was done by Affleck, basically gave all the credit for this fabulous activity to release these Americans, to hide them first of all, and to get them across the border to freedom. They said it was all done by an American group that were basically preparing themselves as a film crew that were there. And it was all there. God bless America, they did it all. Well, that's baloney. We all know historically that it was the Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, and a number of people within the Canadian embassy that, first of all, hid those people for a number of days and got them out. It was not an American film crew. It was the Canadian government. Affleck apparently didn't even know anything about it. And, of course, the Americans just ate up the American version of this. And this happens time and time again. I know we're kind of hitting on sore points here, but it's about time that we started talking about some of this stuff. The Americans, talk about, 1941, World War II had just begun. No, it didn't. World War II began in 1939. America didn't take part in it until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that was, I think, very proportionally, characterized by the movie Churchill and so many other things that, they were begging the Americans to get involved, and they simply didn't want to do it. The Brits and the Canadians and others were doing their best to try to fight this war and to fight Nazi aggression, and the Americans sat on the sidelines for the longest time. But to hear the Americans tell it, well, it was all them. And Trump, of course, being ignorant of history, is still going on with that rant saying that America won World War II. Certainly their involvement was a key factor in this, but it was an allied, of course, collaboration that won the war. But you see, Trump and the Americans simply say, America first, America are the only ones that do good things here, and we're just playing minor roles in this. And that's not what history says, and that's not what's going on. And what bothers me about Ambassador Hoekstra's comments is he seems to be basically carrying on that narrative, and it's false. And although there are probably millions and millions of Americans that are going to simply buy into that because it's, what they want to hear, history tells a different story. And it's about time that we stood up and simply said, you're wrong. This is the way things are. That, yes, America is a dominant economy. Yes, America is still dominant in NATO, for instance. But they don't run it. They're a member and a very strong member, but so is Canada. So are the other nations involved in NATO. And Trump wants NATO and the G7, or as long as he wants to have them go on, he wants to be the straw that stirs the drink here. It's all America this. America sets policy for this. And that's not the way these agencies were set up. That's not the way the global economies were set up, but it's what Donald Trump wants. Donald Trump doesn't like partnerships. Donald Trump loves to simply dominate, and that's going to be a problem, and it has been a problem for us. And it's about time that world leaders like Macron in France and others in other parts of North America, certainly, and Mexico and Canada, have got to stand up and say, sorry, we know you're the big dog here, but you don't call all the shots, that we need to have our input and we need to have our sovereignty respected as well. Trump doesn't want to play that game. And Hoekstra apparently, although he's going to be sitting here, I guess, for how many more years, simply parroting the Trump policies in Ottawa as the American ambassador, we have to stand up and simply say, this is what is best for Canada. And we're not simply going to stand by. We are mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore. And take that message back to Washington, Ambassador Hoekstra. That's it, edition of the podcast. So glad you're with us today. It's about time that we spoke up and spoke our minds about these key issues. And we're going to continue to do that on this podcast in the weeks and days to come as we look at some of the rollouts of some of these policies. Of course, you can catch us on the podcast here on Substack, on Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube, TikTok. We're on many different platforms right now. And it's great that you're with us. It's great that we get feedback from you on the issues that we discuss here. Keep that coming. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing the podcast today. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wissenz Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wissenz Law, 905-522-1102 or wissenslaw.com.